So what I want to say there is to put some of this in a little bit of a context, right, to help us ask this question of the political public role of the church today in some kind of context. It's to help us recognize it this way. Those words, religion and politics, these kinds of things often don't go together very smoothly in our day and age. And those are the kinds of things that we're often told to, not talk about at the dinner table or to keep to the side of conversations because they're too hot. I understand that, right? But one of the things that I do in my own sociological work is help us to recognize why we think that, like why we have that story in our heads that moving religion off the table will allow us to get along better, and what happens when we do that. One way we can understand that is that in the transitions, the long, centuries-long transitions that we've had into our modern or postmodern or secular age, whatever we want to call this time that we live in today, into this transition, one of the things that's happened is that we've begun living together in communities that are not bonded by religious identity, but by something else, often by the power of the nation state, right? So that we're citizens of a nation, of a state, rather than members of a particular religious community. And there were all kinds of huge arguments and disagreements and violence over that, making that kind of transition. But almost virtually all major religions have made that transition to accepting and in fact celebrating the fact that we now live together in a diverse, multicultural political entity called the state, right? And then the question becomes, is there anything that the church has to do now? Or is it just the case that religion ought to be private and removed from the public sphere, right? Because we don't act now we're citizens, not religious participants. We act as publicly as citizens. We vote and we do these things. My contention actually is to disagree with this. And I think that the church itself needs to take much more seriously its role as a political agent. Now, let me say one final thing about what I mean by that. Again, some historical context. If for Catholics, right, speaking now for Catholics, if we can take seriously the fact that the church is to be, in some ways, the bearer of an ongoing conduit through which God is attempting to save the world. We don't need to say the only one. We don't need to say even the most, I don't hear, right? We don't need to say the most primary one. But if we can say that the church is this body, a corporate body through which God is acting to help bring about something like the kingdom of God, then the follow-up question we have to ask is, how are we supposed to do that? Now, there are all kinds of answers that have been given to that question over history. Two quick ones, and then I'll say what my proposal might be for ours today. For the first 300 years of the church, maybe the Edict of Milan was in 313, right? So 300 years or so. We might say that the church's public political activity mostly consisted in martyrdom. That was both, the willingness to suffer and die for a faith, but also witnessing. So public witnessing of multiple kinds. But certainly after Constantine, for a long time, the church's role was no longer martyrdom in this way, but it shifted. And there are lots of descriptors that we could give of this, but one of the most important ones that we could say was the church's political role then was governance, and to participate in helping to govern the world, right? And to do that. Now, at least since 1964, Dignitatis Humanae at the Second Vatican Council, that is no longer what the Catholic Church says our public political role is. The difficulty that we're faced with is that we don't really have a good answer as to what our role ought to be, now that we know our role is no longer to attempt to govern by signing concordats with nation states so that everybody there is officially under a certain religion or these kinds of things. The question then is, what is our role? The word that I think that we might consider, that I'd like us to consider taking up as a descriptor for what that public political role of the church is recognition. It's kind of like martyrdom. It's kind of like witnessing in that way. But I think there's a way for us to understand what we are being called to do as Christians and as Catholics is helping our democratic polities to recognize people who are very different from us in their differences, and to be able to see them and celebrate them there, so that people don't enter the public sphere feeling that I have to claim my own rights, which generates only more divisiveness and bitterness and rivalry, isolation. But instead to say, who are you? And what gift are you bringing to the public sphere? If we could be that, listeners, recognizers in the public sphere, I think that we would do a lot of good for helping the church to answer for ourselves this question of the political role to which we're called in our own times.